Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this year's Spring International Studies guest speaker event. My name is Ann Kim, one of the organizers of the event, and my co-organizer is Dr. Chris Reese, who is also the program coordinator of the International Studies program here at IU East. This year, we're honored to have Dr. Terry K. Park here with us for his talk titled Techno-Orientalism, Yellow Peril Pasts, Asian Futures, and the Marketing of the US Collapse in the Video Game Homefront. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to first thank Indiana University East and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences for making this event possible through its HSS Strategic Initiative Fund. I would also like to thank External Affairs, with special thanks to John Dalton and Kaylee Irvine. At the end of the talk, there will be a Q&A session, during which time please feel free to leave comments or ask questions using the Zoom chat box, or also through the Facebook Live comment box. So now I would like to introduce our speaker today. Terry K. Park is a lecturer in the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland, College Park. He has held faculty positions at Harvard University, Wellesley College, and Miami University of Ohio. Dr. Park's interdisciplinary research focuses on how the Korean War, popularly known as the US's Forgotten War, shaped and continues to shape US liberal empire and trans-Pacific visual culture. His research has been published in peer-reviewed journals like MELIS, Multi-Ethnic Literature of the US, and Critical Military Studies, and he has articles and chapters forthcoming in the Cambridge History of American Popular Culture and 2 anthologies, Teaching Asian America, Pedagogy, Politics, and Practice, and Made in Asia/America, Why Video Games Were Never About Us. So let's welcome Dr. Park. You would like to send
Thank you.
your reactions and claps. And I would like to now have Dr. Park take over the presentation.
Sure thing. Thank you for that great introduction, Dr. Kim. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Reese and the International Studies Program, the Department of External Affairs, and everyone else involved at IU East for making this talk possible. So I'm coming to you from Columbus, Ohio, which is not too far. So even though I teach at the University of Maryland, like a lot of folks, I've been teaching virtually. So I'm not too far from Richmond. And before I go any further, well, let me set up my PowerPoint. Just a moment. It always takes me a few seconds to do this, even when I'm teaching my own classes. There we go. All right, so hopefully folks can see the title slide of my talk. As Dr. Kim mentioned, this talk will focus on a subfield of Asian American studies called Techno-Orientalism. And so this is going to be more like a classroom talk. In fact, I am teaching a course on Techno-Orientalism this semester. So a lot of this content will be from PowerPoints that I've given to various classes, Asian American studies classes. And we'll see how much time we have left at the end. I'm really bad at timing my talks, but hopefully there'll be at least a few minutes for me to discuss briefly my article in progress on the marketing campaign for the video game Homefront, which is where that image there comes from, specifically the sequel or the reimagined 2018 or 2016 edition of Homefront. And for those who don't read Korean, that says annyeong or hello, which seems very welcoming and a good way to start a talk. But within the context of Techno-Orientalism, that hello, that greeting can seem menacing. So that's a little bit of a preview of the talk that I'm going to give. But before I go any further, in light of what's been happening in the last few weeks, and indeed in the last year, and really for the last couple of centuries of anti-Asian violence that has escalated throughout the US. There's no way that I can start this talk, which really does focus on the history of anti-Asian racism in the US, without honoring those lives who were taken away from us, specifically in Atlanta about 2.5, 3 weeks ago. Of course, most people know that 8 people were murdered, including 6 Asian women at a number of spas in the Atlanta area. And again, this illustrates the almost 3,000 reported attacks against Asians and Asian Americans in the US, with almost 70% of these attacks targeting women. And so I would like to take a brief moment of silence to think about the lives that were stolen. I'm not going to announce their names, even though their names have been released in various outlets. It's still not clear if all of the families have given consent for the victims' names to be released. But we all know what happened in Atlanta. And so I'd like to take a brief moment, 30 seconds or so, to think about their lives and all of the Asian and Asian American lives that have been stolen from us in the last year. All right. And here's another image, a related image of specifically Hoosiers at IU Bloomington, who recently held a protest, a rally in support of Asian and Asian Americans across the US and specifically in Indiana. So I wanted to showcase both the vigils as well as the protests that are honoring these lives and communities that have been targeted. And before I forget, at the end of my talk, I'm gonna show an organization in Indiana that's working towards supporting Asian American communities, and ask folks to offer some material support. But in addition to thinking about the lives that were stolen from us, I would also like folks here to think about all of the Asian and Asian Americans in your lives, whether they're in your family, whether you yourself identify as Asian or Asian American, or if there are any restaurants, businesses that you frequent. I'm assuming most of you are coming to us from Richmond or around Richmond. My wife actually was a visiting assistant professor at Earlham College in Richmond. And so I spent some time there and got to know and frequent some of the Asian businesses from Sub and Roll. I don't know if anyone remembers Sub and Roll, apparently closed down a couple of years ago. Great Vietnamese restaurant that's right next to a Vietnamese nail salon. And of course, there are Chinese restaurants, Indian restaurants, and other communities. And that's something I want us to think about, right? Because sometimes folks might assume, oh, that's too bad that this is happening to Asians and Asian Americans, but I don't really see them around me. But I would venture to say that a lot of you have frequented Asian or Asian American businesses in Richmond or throughout Indiana. And so I would like to take another 30 seconds for you to think about those people that you interact with who have delivered your Chinese takeout, or that Vietnamese worker who has given you that pedicure or manicure and the other low-wage workers, many of whom are the most vulnerable in our communities and the ones who are being the most targeted during this intense wave of anti-Asian racism. I'd like you to really think and imagine their faces. Think about, maybe if you haven't already, checking in with them, a question that you might ask them, ways that you can support them during this incredibly horrific time for Asian and Asian Americans, including in Indiana. So let's take another 30 seconds to do that work. All right, thank you for that. And again, I really encourage folks, the next time you go to your favorite Thai restaurant or Indian restaurant in Richmond, that you really check in with those folks. I'm sure they would really appreciate it. All right. So I would like to start my talk on Techno-Orientalism, Yellow Peril Pasts, Asian Futures, with a brief look at this person, Senator John Miller of California. So John Miller, born in 1831, died in 1886, was a lawyer, businessman, and a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. Although he was a senator from California, he was actually born in Indiana, specifically South Bend, where he established a law practice before moving to Napa in California. Of course, Napa being famous for its wineries, and not as known is the Chinese labor that went into producing and creating these famous wineries. And so in Napa, John Miller continued his career as a lawyer before becoming the county treasurer. Then he returned to Indiana, to South Bend in 1855 to resume his law practice before getting elected to the Indiana State Senate in 1860. The following year, during the Civil War, he was commissioned by the governor of Indiana as a colonel of the 29th Indiana Infantry. And then after the Civil War ended in 1865, he went back to California, where he was elected to the US Senate from 1881 until his death 5 years later. The reason why I bring him up, not just because he is a Hoosier, but because he is known for introducing several bills against Chinese immigrants during another time of intense anti-Asian racism. His first bills were blocked, but eventually the last bill that he introduced to Congress was eventually signed by President Chester Arthur, becoming the Chinese Exclusion Act, the infamous federal law that targeted a single racial or ethnic group for the first time in US history, meaning that Chinese immigrants were barred from entering the US. Chinese immigrants already in the US could not naturalize as US citizens. And this law, which was passed in 1882, established the modern day immigration system, the system that we live with today. And during the debates around exclusion, Chinese exclusion, this is what he wrote in an op-ed piece for the San Francisco Bulletin in February of 1882, just a couple of months before the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Quote, "The Chinese laborers of today are men who, by long training and by hereditary, which has been stamped upon them and ground into them through centuries of time, have become hardy, enduring, machine-like in every physical characteristic. And I bold that phrase, machine-like, for pretty clear reasons, considering that this talk is about techno-orientalism. And furthermore, he writes, quote, "To compete with the Chinese, the white man must become such a man as the Chinaman is." Of course, Chinaman being a racially derogatory term for those of Chinese descent. He must work as the Chinaman works, subsist on cheap food, and inure himself to the same disgusting and parsimonious diet. He must adopt the packing habits in which the shelter and space now required for one white man will be sufficient for 10 Chinamen. So already here in this op-ed by Senator Miller, 1882, we have a language of science fiction being used to justify, well, first to racialize Chinese laborers as machine-like, as almost akin to robots, or maybe more appropriately, cyborgs, whose efficiency or hyper-efficiency is supposedly the reason for the degradation of white working class whiteness in the 1880s. And of course, the US is rapidly industrializing across the US, from Indiana to California. And Chinese laborers are being hired as so-called cheap labor. And they're the ones who are being targeted for the reasons why especially white working class folks are unable to find jobs, are being displaced, and instead of the robber barons, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the ones who are amassing incredible amounts of wealth based on the exploitation of not just Chinese workers, but also Irish and other European immigrants. But the bullseye is not on these robber barons, these captains of industry, but on the so-called Chinamen, and specifically the machine-like Chinamen. So in thinking about the history of Techno-Orientalism, a lot of scholars say we need to go all the way back to the 1880s during this time of intense anti-Chinese sentiment. And also this is when science fiction novels and other speculative fictions are being written, borrowing from the image of the factory, the assembly line that are that is part of this nascent emergence of industrialization. And so the words of Senator John Miller are really important to keep in mind in thinking about this longer history of Techno-Orientalism. But we can't arrive at a definition of Techno-Orientalism without thinking of Orientalism, which is a foundational concept in post-colonial studies, ethnic studies, and specifically Asian American studies. So when I teach my introductory Asian American studies classes, we start with Edward Said's influential work. So what is Orientalism? Said defines it generally as the imagining of Asians and Asia, or the so-called East or the Orient, as arrested in a timeless, traditional past, lacking in Western civilization, Western technology, of course, ignoring how there already is civilization and technology in the so-called East, but representing them as in need of rescue from a modern, progressive West, whether in paintings or music or travel guides, novels, visual representations, sonic representations, textual representations. 500 years of these representations have trapped the so-called Orient in these particular ways. And these images, these representations are not innocent, Edward Said argues. They don't exist in a vacuum, but they came out of and justified Western imperial expansion throughout the Middle East, North Africa, which is really where Edward Said focused his analysis, but also extending this concept to South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, as well as the Pacific Islands, anywhere where the French, the British, and eventually the Americans went and conquered and attempted to reason their imperial presence in these places as beneficial, as a humanitarian project to uplift the so-called backward savages from their state of savagery. But it's important to keep in mind that Orientalism as a framework, an interpretive framework, didn't just construct a notion of the East or the Orient as backwards, as arrested in time, but it also established a stable identity for the West. So just as the East is a creation, a fantasy conjured up in the minds of Europeans, many of whom never set foot in the very places that they wrote about or painted or sculpted. This also established an identity for the West as progressive, modern, democratic, rational, etc. And so this framework is really the foundation by which we get to a notion of techno-Orientalism, which I'll define a bit more in a few slides. But just to make sure that we're connecting this to Asian American studies, as well as this climate of anti-Asian hostility, how can we think of Orientalism in relation to Asian American identity? And some of the questions that continually assault and racialize Asian bodies in the US as different, as possibly inferior. And this form of racialization can be encapsulated in the question that I've gotten my entire life growing up in Utah, as well as other places in the US. And maybe some of you who identify as Asian or Asian American have been on the receiving end of this question. And really, it's two questions. The first one, where are you from? And always, it's accompanied by the second question, no, where are you really from? So if the answer of Vermont is given for the first question, or in my case, Utah, that's usually not sufficient for a lot of folks who have been conditioned to think of Asian and Asian Americans as arrested or frozen in time outside of the US, that they cannot really be from Vermont, or I can't really be from Salt Lake City, Utah, or have been born in Southern California, right? There's this notion that you must be from somewhere else. You can't really be American. And of course, that the logic underlying that question, that Orientalist logic, is that Americanness equals whiteness. And so Asianists are positioned outside the imaginary borders of the US, of what it means to be an American. In fact, I'd like to ask folks here, for those who identify as Asian or Asian American, by a virtual hand raise, if you can find that button, or you can just use the chat box, who amongst you have been asked some variation of this question? And I see Anne already with her virtual hand raise. And I wonder how many times certain individuals have been asked this question. I see some more virtual hand raising, and look around to see who in this room has been on the receiving end of these questions. Yeah. And this is a particular form of racialization aimed at Asian and Asian Americans, which is also illustrated by, and I don't know if there are any figure skating fans, but for those of you who are, you might recognize this person, Michelle Kwan, who competed in multiple Winter Olympics for Team USA. And in 1998, at the Nagano Winter Olympics in Japan, she was favored to win the gold medal in the individual competition. She ended up losing to her teammate, also on Team USA, of course. And this was the headline from MSNBC the following morning. American beats out Kwon. Take a moment to sit with that headline. What does that headline assume about Michelle Kwon? Despite competing at the highest stage of athletic competition for her country being the United States, born in the US, raised in the US, I believe she's second generation, like myself, and yet it's assumed that she is not American. No matter what she does, no matter how long she's lived here, or any of us have lived here, we are still seen as perpetual foreigners. And again, Orientalism provides the representational meanings that have preceded the arrival of Asians to the US by hundreds of years, so that people come to understand Asianness, Asian bodies, Asian American people, culture as not fully American, not American enough. Now, during times of peace, these sorts of seemingly innocuous questions of where are you from may seem like that, innocent. But during times of war, and during the 20th century, the US fought multiple wars with Asian countries, or public health crises. These sorts of questions and this discourse of the perpetual foreigner can become quite deadly. And that's what we call yellow peril. So what is yellow peril exactly? A lot of Asian American studies scholars have offered definitions. Here is one by Kent Ono and Vincent Pham, the co-editors of Asian Americans in the Media, a great text that I use in my Asian American media classes. They define yellow peril as the representations of Asians and Asian Americans as threatening to take over, invade, or otherwise negatively Asianize the US nation, its society, and culture. And again, when we look at the 1870s, 1880s, during this time of the anti-Chinese movement, we can see quite clearly yellow peril being born. And there were many political cartoons at the time that amplified this message of Chinese labor as quote unquote cheap labor, as it's written on that weapon that the Chinese migrant labor is holding. What else is there? Chopsticks. Again, cheap labor about to attack, threaten the body of a innocent white working class person. And we still see images of yellow peril today. There are so many. This is just one screenshot of the remake of the classic 1980s Cold War film Red Dawn. In that version, it was the Soviet Union and Nicaragua teaming up to invade and occupy the US. And then in the remake, it's North Korea invading and occupying the US. A far-fetched scenario that we'll return to when I briefly discuss my work. And so another way to think about yellow peril is as a discourse, a set of representations, or what the cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall calls a conceptual map that makes Asian Americans intelligible, legible, as threatening, as invasive, through its structural embeddedness in a range of media. We saw a couple of examples, right, of yellow peril in political cartoons from the late 19th century, to novels, short stories, Pulp Fiction, trafficked in yellow peril imagery, even oranges. Apparently this was named Yellow Peril brand profited off of a Yellow Peril discourse. And of course, the most recent example, former President Trump calling COVID-19 the China virus, Kung flu, the Wuhan virus, right? Building off of really a centuries-long racialization of Asians and Asian Americans as a danger, a pollutant to the body, the individual body, the white body, the body of the nation, the health of America. And so that's why I refer to Yellow Peril as a weaponization of Orientalism, a weaponization of those seemingly innocent questions of where are you from, that assumes that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners, that during times of an economic crisis, a public health crisis, a war, whether a war on the battlefields or a so-called trade war with China or in the 1980s Japan, this structural embeddedness of Yellow Peril can become quite dangerous. Another visual example, and this was actually, this came out before COVID-19 as part of the anti-vaxxer movement. You can just take a look at this image, the various signifiers, visual signifiers, textual signifiers that encode, to use the language of Stuart Hall, a dominant hegemonic meaning of Asian Americans as invasive threats to the literal physical body, health of Americans. So even though they're listed as being from California, Oklahoma, New Jersey, and again, Oklahoma, the text suggests that they're not quite from here. They're from somewhere else, and that they have an ulterior motive, right? They're this lingering suspicion of Asian Americans as having an allegiance to an outside foreign power is what makes them dangerous, is the weaponization of Orientalism. And this only became amplified during COVID-19, this current period of anti-Asian violence being directed at especially East Asian presenting bodies. But as we saw just a few days ago with the Philippine ex-woman who was attacked in New York City, anyone presenting as Asian is subject to this weaponization of Orientalism. And in order to really thoroughly understand where this comes from, we really need to be specific, right? And so let's go through some of the pivotal historical moments that fueled Yellow Peril. Of course, we already talked about the anti-Chinese movement from the late 1860s, even past the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. In the 1890s, there still continued to be violence, lynchings of Chinese throughout the US West. This notion of Chinese bodies as a terror, as the text there indicates, it says the yellow terror in all his glory. And think about the gendered and sexualized dimensions of Yellow Peril as illustrated in this political cartoon. And then, as I mentioned, many lynchings of Chinese migrants happen throughout the US West. And Yellow Peril, it's not just about us. I mean, there is no authentic truth of Chineseness or Asianness that's being offered. But these images really illustrate anxieties of whiteness, of Westernness, of the US, the kinds of bodies that are being seen as under attack, whether it's white womanhood, which often stands in for the purity and reproductive power and futurity of the American nation as being threatened by Yellow Peril bodies, or Americanness and specifically nationality, as illustrated there in the political cartoon on the left. Who gets to become an American and therefore have access to the rights and resources that US citizenship offers, and that must be guarded at all costs against this yellow peril threat, and which was mobilized to justify the exclusion of Chinese bodies to protect the borders of the US, the nation, the bodies that populate America. That's really what yellow peril is about. The sort of anxieties of whiteness and how they must be stabilized, guarded. Same thing happened during the anti-Japanese movement. So we can think of the anti-Chinese movement as the template that was used in subsequent anti-Asian movements. And so well before Executive Order 9066 was signed by FDR, that led to the wartime incarceration of almost 120,000 Japanese Americans along the West Coast, already we see, or way before that, we see anti-Japanese movements as illustrated there in that image. A meeting organized by the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League, one of the leading forces of anti-Japanese hostility. And we have this photo, which when I first saw this, at first I assumed that this was taken after the attack of Pearl Harbor, but in fact, this photo is from 1920, a couple of decades before the Pearl Harbor attack. And then, of course, with Pearl Harbor and the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, this was amplified by various Orientalist weaponized images of Japanese Americans as a so-called fifth column. And as you can probably tell from the artistry there, that is Dr. Seuss, who has definitely made the headlines in the past few weeks. He worked in the US Wartime Propaganda Office and drew many images of Japanese Americans as untrustworthy, suspicious, having loyalties to Japan, even though there was not a single shred of evidence that showed that Japanese Americans were committing sabotage in the US. There was the anti-Asian Indian movement as well in the early 20th century, where Asian Indian workers coming south from Canada and then south from Washington, who were targeted by white supremacist movements in Canada, were called a Hindu invasion or a dusky peril. And so brown peril or dusky peril is the South Asian equivalent or complement to yellow peril, but many of the same logics are there, right? Racializing South Asian American workers as threats to white working class identities, opportunities, and power. And then the anti-Philippine X movement quickly followed on the heels of the other movements in the 1920s and 30s, driven by the racialization of the Filipinx as so-called savages or little brown monkeys, which is how they were referred to when the US was debating the question of whether they should colonize the Philippines. And when Filipinx workers migrated to California, they were subject to mob violence, including here in Watsonville, California, when they were driven out of town. And so this is the history of yellow peril as a weaponization of Orientalism that scholars of Techno-Orientalism have not just built off of, but reimagined through a Techno-Orientalist lens. And so let's hear some definitions, read some definitions of Techno-Orientalism. Some of the first instances of it being used is from an academic text in 1995 by David Morley and Kevin Robbins, Spaces of Identity, which explored Japanese culture and specifically cyberpunk culture, which emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. And they were really wondering within cyberpunk culture, why Japan figured so prominently as a threat in the US in the 1980s. And this is what they argued, quote, within the political and cultural unconscious of the West, Japan has come to exist as the figure of empty and dehumanized technological power. It represents the alienated and dystopian image of capitalist progress. This provokes both resentment and envy. And they're really thinking about specific films like Blade Runner, one of the more popular representations of cyberpunk culture in the US, that illustrates this ambivalent relationship with not just Japan, but what Japan represented. The sort of uneasiness of rapid industrialization, high-tech capitalism, and how it leads to the alienation of the American individual. But in these representations, Morley and Robbins see how Japan and Japanese culture is represented as cold, impersonal, machine-like, to invoke the words of Senator John Miller, soulless, and therefore the Japanese people are figured as unfeeling aliens, cyborgs, replicants, not quite human, subhuman. And this notion of Techno-Orientalism was taken up by Asian American studies scholars. So, for example, in his introductory essay to a special issue on the figure of the alien Asian, Stevenson in 2006 writes, quote, alien/Asians conduct themselves with superb technological efficiency and capitalist expertise, whose affectual absence, the lack of emotion, resonates as an underdeveloped, or worse still, a retrograde humanism. As it's shown in this image, a screenshot from Ghost in the Shell, right? So again, we see these anxieties, this discomfort of capitalism degrading Americanness, whiteness, to something below human. And this is represented in so many representations of Japanese culture. And furthermore, Dr. Son writes that Techno-Orientalism is fueled by a desire to denigrate the unfeeling, automaton-like Asian/alien, and an envy that derives from the West's desire to regain primacy within the global economy. So Techno-Orientalism is a bit of a contrast to Edward Said's conceptualization of Orientalism, where if in traditional Orientalism, Asia is figured as stuck in the past, arrested in time, lacking civilization, and even the capacity to modernize. Techno-Orientalism recognizes that you have all of these Asian economies, especially in the 1960s and 70s, the rise of the four Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, that are not only have technology, but almost an excess of technology, an excess of efficiency and high-tech capitalism. And that's where we get this ambivalence, this notion of envy, that the West is somehow now behind all of these Asian countries that were formerly stuck in the past, but also how this Asian technology is figured as the wrong kind of technology, a dehumanized and dehumanizing retrograde technology. And then furthermore, in a great anthology called Techno-Orientalism by David Rowe, Betsy Huang, and Greta New, their definition of Techno-Orientalism is, quote, the phenomenon of imagining Asia and Asians in hypo or hyper-technological terms in cultural productions and political discourse that has become part of the West project of securing dominance as architects of the future, a project that requires configurations of the East as the very technology with which to shape it. So even in this discourse of Techno-Orientalism, which does recognize China, South Korea, India as leaders in various forms of technology, the West is still in a dominant position, right? That the West's technology is seen as more human than Asian technology. But again, just like in Orientalism, where underlying it is anxieties of whiteness and anxieties of the future of whiteness, the same thing is happening in Techno-Orientalism, right? These Western speculations of an Asianized future, one that surpasses, displaces, and occupies the West. And one example that really illustrates these anxieties is in the marketing for Homefront. And so I'm going to show a trailer, or really it's the opening cinematic sequence in the first Homefront video game. And I want to show this, especially if we don't have enough time to really go into my own research on Homefront. But let me switch over to this clip and let you take a look at some of these themes of Techno-Orientalism. Let me share sound and optimize for video clip. All right, hopefully you can hear this.
The torpedo that sunk the Cheonan and took the lives of 46 South Korean sailors was fired by a North Korean submarine.
North Korea's weapons program continues to intensify. Now surpassed 1,000 missiles.
Global leaders expressed concern over North Korea's latest atomic test.
Kim Jong-il's government strongly defended its recent atomic test as a rightful response to Western aggression. The president appeared at the UN to call for severe sanctions against North Korea.
This morning comes the news of Kim Jong-il's death. North Koreans greet their new supreme leader, Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un.
우리 공화국의 통일은 남한과의 한민족을 갖고 올 것이며 경제와 산업의 발전을 갖고 올 것입니다.
Today, our beloved leader, Kim Jong-un, has united North and South Korea, forming the Greater Korean Republic.
Talks to end the Saudi-Iran war have stalemated once again. Meanwhile, damaged oil wells and pipelines burn uncontrollably, deeply affecting world supplies.
Although costs at the pump are ready to break the dreaded $20 ceiling,
The only good communist is a dead communist!
Across the nation, civil unrest has intensified with the demise of the U.S. dollar.
This is not a retreat, nor are we abandoning our Asian allies.
Under threat of annihilation by the Greater Korean Republic, Japan has surrendered.
Martial law is now in effect. Excessive force will be used.
hours after the president ordered a freeze on bank withdrawals.
We don't know where we will get our next meal from.
The Mexican government has imposed strict immigration quotas, effectively closing its borders to American refugees.
Koreans' annexation continues to spread despite the U.S. Today, the Greater Korean Republic launched their latest communication satellite, claiming it will bring a message of peace to the entire world.
All right. God, every time I see that, I'm just blown away even more and more. Yeah, so I think the signifiers of techno-Orientalism, many of them you could probably identify. Yeah, talk about fear mongering. And I'm just now seeing your comments, so I'm sorry if I missed any questions or comments. But yeah, so just to contextualize the first Homefront, it was released in 2010. So this was during the Cheonan submarine incident. I don't know if folks remember that, but it was a South Korean submarine that was destroyed, apparently by North Korean forces. And so that clip of Hillary Clinton, that was an actual piece of footage that was incorporated into the cinematic opening, and integrated into this techno-orientalist alternative future. And so they actually predicted accurately the death of Kim Jong-il, who was still alive at this point during the production of Homefront, and then who died, and then his son gets elected, which they accurately predicted. But of course, the rest of that narrative is, I mean, obviously pretty unrealistic. But for me, that's not really the question, right? A lot of these techno-orientalist fantasies are not based on some objective truth. But they're referencing and reproducing certain meanings of Asianness as invasive, and also reproducing certain meanings of the US, of whiteness, of capitalism as under attack, as vulnerable to an invasion, whether invasion by Asian bodies or Asian technology. And so in my paper, I look at some of the marketing campaigns for Homefront, both the first one as well as the reimagined or sequel that was released in 2016. And I think actually I have enough time to get to some of those marketing campaigns, but let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right. Yeah. And so, right, techno-Orientalism also reflects this notion of quote unquote globalism, which has been a popular term for those on the right, especially by Trump supporters. This fear of especially China, as well as other Asian countries, as modern, industrialized, and in cahoots with each other to invade the privacy and steal the identities and data of everyday Americans, which is really the focus of my analysis of the second Homefront. And then here's another definition that I think is helpful of techno-Orientalism by Lok Soo and Claire Chun. They define it as the expressive vehicle by which Western and Eastern nations articulate their fears, desires, and anxieties that are produced in their competitive struggle to gain technological hegemony. Yeah. And right, just showed that opening. And so from here, I want to move into particular figures, cultural figures of techno-Orientalism, many of which we saw in that cinematic opening for Homefront. And so, of course, first and foremost is the machine-like techno-Orientalist robot, which again, we see during the anti-Chinese movement, this notion of a monstrous, almost a melding of monster and machine, or animal and machine, as indicated in the almost octopus-like representation of this Chinese laborer as hyper efficient, using various tools in a cyborgian kind of way to create wealth for himself, for China, as indicated in that money bag being sent to China, and which displaces white working class immigrants that you can kind of see there on the right. They're cut off, but they're supposed to be Irish immigrant workers who are our boys. So already we see Irishness as being gradually included into whiteness through and against the machine-like robotic figure of the Chinese laborer. And I think you can still see this figure today. In fact, American Factory, that Netflix documentary made a couple of years ago by two filmmakers in Yellow Springs, where my wife and I used to live, and not too far from Richmond, right? This factory bought by a Chinese company, which, I think it shows a couple of Chinese workers in very humane ways, but I would argue it also engages and traffics in images of Chinese workers as hyper efficient, thus displacing the bodies of white American workers, so-called real American workers. Also, the Russo-Japanese War is another pivotal historical moment in Techno-Orientalism, where we get this image of a mechanized imperial Japan, since this war had Japan defeating Russia, which freaked out a lot of Western imperial nations, right? Japan was seen as Orientalist, stuck in the past, but they've adopted Western technology, Western forms of military organization. And so there's a kind of envy and resentment of Japanese technological progress, where they're seen as the sort of managers, the sort of intellectual bosses of this sort of Asian order, and where Chineseness is positioned as the kind of brainless workers that can threaten the West. And this was amplified by the short stories of Jack London, both in his reporting of the Russo-Japanese War. He was a journalist before he became a famous writer, where he perpetuated some of these stereotypes of Asianness. And then in The Unparalleled Invasion, this speculative fiction of a growing Chinese menace that eventually, that is led by Japan and then threatens the primacy of the West, and then the West bands together to basically commit biological warfare against China, a very scary harbinger and reversal of what's happening right now. And so this is where we get the figure of the techno-orientalist despot, most prominently made famous by Fu Manchu and the many films and written short stories, and which gave birth to other similar techno-orientalist despots, from Ming the Merciless in Flash Gordon to Dr. No in James Bond, Mola Ram, I think his name is, the evil guy in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Big Trouble in Little China, another sort of remake of the Fu Manchu villain, and then more recently, Randall Park's role as Kim Jong-il in The Interview. And then another figure is the techno-orientalist clone or sleeper agent. This really grew out of, I would argue, the Cold War and McCarthyist fears that anyone could be a communist, your neighbor could be a communist, could be a spy for the Soviet Union, made famous especially by Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and which influenced future or subsequent representations of Asian or Asian Americans as mass-produced robots or copies who have an allegiance to an outside power, an outside force. And this particular representation of the sleeper agent, of course, quickly spread after 9/11, right? This fear that anyone could be an enemy of the state. And then relatedly, we have the image of the techno-orientalist sex worker, which definitely has resonances right now with what happened in Atlanta. Philips, the company, came out with a commercial that played off of images of Asian American women as almost like pleasure bots for whiteness. Again, this screenshot from Ghost in a Shell, the figure of the robot geisha. There we have another techno-orientalist sex worker from the film Ex Machina. And that's actually from a new show by Netflix called Love, Death, and Robots that I would say challenges some of these techno-orientalist representations, but this is another figure. And then quickly, in the 1980s, during the so-called trade war between the US and Japan, when Detroit automakers began to collapse, Japanese cars became very popular, and many white auto workers found themselves unemployed, not just in Detroit, but in other deindustrialized cities throughout the Midwest. This also gave rise to the notion of Asianness invading American cities, especially in the 1982 film Blade Runner, a reimagined Los Angeles that has become orientalized through the skyline, through specific Asian bodies, and which I would say created the context for the murder of Vincent Chin, who I wish I had more time to talk about, but he was a Chinese American auto worker in Detroit, mistaken as Japanese by two unemployed Detroit auto workers, and was murdered during this time of an economic crisis and yellow peril fears of Japan Inc. taking over. I wish I had time to talk about Transformers. And then also a little bit more contemporary is this figure of the techno-orientalist scientist, which draws on a lot of these other previous figures, again, of the highly educated, highly skilled Asian or Asian American who, even if he grew up in the US most of his life, like Wen-Ho Lee, a Taiwanese American scientist accused of sending secrets, nuclear secrets to China, was arrested and placed in solitary confinement before he was released. And other images of techno-orientalist scientists using their education for nefarious purposes, including in Godzilla versus King Kong, which I just watched a few days ago. Sorry, spoiler alert, but there is a techno-orientalist scientist, Japanese guy, who pilots Mecha Godzilla, and almost like, again, there's this melding of animal and machine, or techno-orientalism and orientalism coming together to invade and threaten the world. So lots of representations. I could go more and more into them, including on my own work on Homefront, the video game. But I can answer some questions about my research on that game or anything else that came up in the chat box. So I'll end it right there. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Park, so much for that informative and thought-provoking lecture. Yes, if anyone wants to turn on their videos at this point, feel free to, and you can also unmute yourselves if you want to ask questions. But there were some questions that came through the chat box. Should we start with that? The first question came from Dr. Berdor. Quick question regarding Said's definition of Orientalism. Does he mean rescue from by the West, or rescue by the West, or both?
Oh, sorry if the grammar was a little bit off there. It's the West as the hero, the rescuer of the passive Asian country, culture, people. So it's, yeah, how the West is figured as a benevolent presence that has that is civilized and democratic and rational, and introduces these cultural elements to places that supposedly lack civilization, democracy, progress, etc. Yeah, sorry about if that grammar was a little confusing.
Got it. There's another question from Nathan Froby. I wonder if the machine-like perception comes from their development of manga anime with a lot of mechanical themes arising in those works.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that raises a question of, in what ways do certain Asian countries or culture industries profit or are complicit, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, in these techno-orientalist representations. I saw, when I skimmed really quickly, someone mentioned Akira, which is often cited as one of the classic cyberpunk fictions, right? But yeah, I was gonna mention briefly or show, I think I did show an image from Next Gen, which is an anime that was released a few years ago on Netflix. And it was made by, I think it was a co-production between a Chinese company and maybe an American company. And in that film, and I'll go back to that slide, the main villain is that person in the bottom corner, a CEO, who is the inventor and owner of this company that produces these robots that are supposed to help humans, right? A very common narrative line or trope, but that he himself his name, I think it's Asian or Asian appearing, or he's coded as Asian, but he himself is a robot. Spoiler alert, sorry. And he's controlled by an evil robot. And so, again, right, manga, anime, and other Asian culture industries are there ways in which they traffic in some of these techno-orientalist representations, and how can that be figured into such an analysis? Big Hero 6, yeah, that's a film that a lot of my students love to cite, and I think the creators either of that film or of Next Gen, or maybe both, have often invoked Blade Runner as something they didn't want to portray the futuristic American city in a Blade Runner, a dystopic kind of way, but an argument can be made that maybe unwittingly they're still relying on certain techno-orientalist tropes, whether in terms of the space of the American city or the body of the Asian American person, robot, etc.
Yeah. There's another, I think it was a question/comment from Denise Bullock. I missed the date of Senator Miller's comments on machine-like Asian workers, but so it's in contrast with Frederick Taylor's scientific management publication in about 1910, in which mechanization of labor was presented as efficient and desirable. How do we go from demeaning that mechanization of labor when associated with Asians to the quote unquote American model of labor?
That's a good question. So that quote from Senator Miller was from 1882, February of 1882. So again, just a few months before the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I guess a couple of decades before Taylorism and Fordism, right? The scientific study and configuration of the space of the factory, right, to make it more efficient, came out. Yeah, I mean, again, you see Asianness or Asian technology seen as an excess, right? That even when it properly copies or models Western forms of technology efficiency, there's always that underlying Orientalist logic that there's something different about this form of technology that can make them a threat, right? And I mean, it's interesting. I think she located Frederick Taylor's study in the 1920s, which is during a time of another surge of intense anti-Asian hatred that led to the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act that blocked all Asians. I mean, it was really targeted at Japanese immigrants, but in effect, it prevented all Asians from entering the U.S. And this was a time during which the Ku Klux Klan probably was at its most powerful in its history. I'm thinking of what's that famous? I'm forgetting the name of that novel in which they cite a white supremacist book that talks about the colored nations of the world invading the US, invading whiteness. And so I wonder if in these studies and sort of elevation of the American worker, how Asianness is always outside, always separate from, right? A perpetual foreigner to the figure of the real American worker, and how that trickles into our discussions of labor efficiency today.
So somebody had a question he wanted to ask verbally. Nathan, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, so I couldn't figure out how to put it into like text words, but it was about, so you mentioned some of this, how it can maybe like cyclical in how we perceive them with some techno-orientalist view, and then maybe that feeds back into their culture. I'm specifically thinking like in terms of like anime, manga, and video games, because that's my background, and seeing how like those tropes ended up being things that maybe they latched onto and expanded and took back for their own, but then they just keep getting cycled through things. And especially since you're dealing with like Homefront, that might be up your alley. So,
yeah, I'm just thinking of, I think there was a recent Netflix documentary on the history of video games, and they interviewed the creators of Super Mario Brothers, and how, and not just those creators, but I think just the little I know about the history of Japanese video games, how they intentionally de-racialized or de-racinated a lot of characters and plot lines to make it more palatable to a white American or Western audience. And in fact, that anthology that Dr. Kim mentioned in my intro, Made in Asia/America, which is an anthology on Asian American video game studies. One of the co-editors, Tara Fickle, she has this amazing book, which I'm still reading, which focuses on Pokemon Go and other Japanese video games, and how they intentionally kind of whiten the characters so that there's almost no trace of Japaneseness, which allows it to circulate.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that, because like consuming that kind of media, I've always noticed, I'm like, I know like some of these stories are very specifically like set in Japan, but I'm like, that character looks not remotely like someone from that region. Like Goku from Dragon Ball, clearly a Japanese character, but looks just as white as the driven snow.
Right, and of course, whitewashing has been a hot topic in the last few years in terms of Hollywood's historic displacement of Asian bodies from our own storylines. But yeah, Mario and Luigi, two Italian-American plumbers from Brooklyn. And I think that documentary on Netflix talks about how the creators came upon selecting that particular identity. So I think there's a lot of interesting, and maybe there already is work out there, and maybe I'm not aware of it, but other kinds of ethnic difference, Italian Americanness, maybe there's something there where there's a difference, but it's an acceptable kind of difference, right? Rather than, I don't know, if they had made them Japanese plumbers, would Super Mario, well, it probably wouldn't have been called Super Mario, Super something else, have been just as popular? I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions. So one is, can Techno-Orientalism be molded to certain countries? For instance, during the Cold War, I know it was sometimes common to depict the Soviet Union as part of the Asian hordes that were coming for the West. Yet today, the alt-right seems to view Russia as an ally, maybe because of their strong anti-LGBTQ policies. And Russia does not seem to be depicted the same way. I would like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm just flipping through, so sorry if you're like, oh, what's that image? I wanted to get to some images of the second Homefront Revolution, which really plays off of anxieties of China, and specifically China as a global thief of data, right? Which has been in the news, of course, in the last few years. And so it's, again, the question is often asked, like, why did they choose North Korea as the main villain in both Homefronts? no way could North Korea become this global empire, occupy the US. Is it because North Korea doesn't matter as a market? And I would say, I think North Korea, the sort of specific techno-orientalism of North Korea, has this purpose of fungibility, that North Korea, especially in the Homefront marketing, is a flexible signifier of, as I argue with Homefront Revolution, of China, right? And so in this re-envisioning of Homefront, they imagine basically Silicon Valley is happening in North Korea. So North Korea invents the first personal computer, the Apex one, as you can see there in the bottom left. They invent the first iPhone, right? It basically, they put Apple and Steve Jobs in North Korea. And this company Apex becomes so powerful, they get involved in weapons manufacturing, which the US buys in droves to fight their wars in the Middle East. And then Apex uses all this military technology, as well as the iPhone, the Apex computer, the Apex watch, as a backdoor technology, right? They planted something in these devices to trigger an opening and disable the US infrastructure and US military, weaken them, and that allows North Korea to invade America. So you see like a lot of melding and mixing of Chinese techno-orientalism. North Korea is almost the face, the fungible face of Chinese techno-orientalism, as in Homefront Revolution. So yeah, I think it's interesting how there are particular techno-orientalist constructions of certain countries, and then they kind of get mixed a little bit in some of these fantasies. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one last question. This was a great presentation. Dr. Park, can you speak or give some ideas on what we as a community can and should do to continue to address the renewed phase on anti-Asian hate?
Yes, and I'm glad that question was asked, because that is a good segue into some concrete ways that folks can help out locally. So let me stop sharing the PowerPoint and switch over to, where is it? Right there. So, okay, there's the website. Let me share screen that. Yeah, so I've decided that I am going to donate $500 of my honorarium, which is the majority of the honorarium, to NAPOF Indiana. So NAPOF stands for National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. It's a national Asian American women-led organization with branches all over the US. I've been a longtime friend and ally of NAPOF, and when I was thinking about how best to use this platform and the honorarium to amplify the work of local Asian American organizations, I was happy to see that there's an Indiana branch of NAPOF. And so here is their website, and I encourage folks to take a look, and I can even drop the link in the chat box.
Oh, I just did.
And you oh, good. I'm glad you did that. So for anyone, and I hope there are still folks here. Oh, good. I will match donations of up to $500. So basically, your donation will be doubled, right? Also, NAPOF Indiana has a campaign happening right now, in which they're asking Governor Holcomb to speak out against the spike in anti-Asian violence, not just in the US, but also in Indiana. And here they list some incidences of anti-Asian racism in Indiana. And I just dropped the link there just to make it easier. So I encourage folks to sign this petition, spread the word. In fact, Indiana University, I'm assuming Bloomington, has already signed on as an institutional endorser. I would love to see IU East join IU Bloomington as well. But yeah, folks can support NAPOF by signing this petition, donating, and if you decide to donate, so that we can track the donations, please enter this code, which I'm going to type right now in the chat box, IU East Talk. So that way we can see right how many donations came from this talk. These are just some of the ways, like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, checking in with your Asian or Asian American friends, the businesses that you frequent, seeing if they're okay. I know near Dayton, where Professor Kim lives, there's a Thai Vietnamese restaurant that my wife and I used to frequent that was vandalized multiple times, in fact. So there is a great need, right, for all of us to offer some support, and we can show up in so many ways. My wife is actually going to take a bystander intervention class, so she can beat up any potential attacker, which my mom is very happy about. So, you know, if you feel brave enough, you can sign up for one of those classes. And I think Asian Americans Advancing for Justice are offering, or yeah, if you just Google bystander intervention, anti-Asian racism, you can find some of those classes. Yeah, and just learning more about the history of Asian Americans, right? More courses, more professors will, you know, enable that understanding, that informed understanding and dialogue that can institute real change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park. That was amazing. And I urge everyone to, if you can, to donate to this great organization. And can we all give him a really huge, big applause?
Thank you.
Or claps?
Yeah.
Well,
appreciate it.
Thank you. Yay. Thank you so much. So if you have any like last minute, you know, questions that you want to ask, you know, us or Dr. Park, we'll hang out here for a few minutes, if you don't mind. Otherwise, the talk is over. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
And thank you, Dr. Kim, and everyone else who made this possible. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I'll also save the chat and send it to you as well, because we have some great comments coming in through here.
Yeah, like the Akira. Yeah, I saw the Akira. Yeah, there are a lot of questions I wish I could have noticed.